Welcome to Press Coverage. I am Theo Gremminger, and at Press Coverage, I'm looking to bring you the sharpest guests, and I'm trying to find you the edges that you need to win in fantasy football. It gets harder and harder every year, but my guest today is one of the sharper ones in the industry, and that's Mike Leone of Establish the Run. Mike, you guys are crushing it this offseason. We just had John Daigle on Press Coverage recently. He was great. But one thing that I know you're working on that's super cool is you guys have a supplemental best ball package. What's that entail? And sort of what are you doing with that?
Yeah, so this is the first time we've had a best ball specific package. So we're excited to have that. We have rankings for like all the major best ball sites, Underdog Best Ball Mania, FFPC, the 125 that they've got going on, DraftKings Best Ball Rankings, Drafters, pretty much everything we've got covered. So we've got pretty extensive rankings. This year, Daigle, who you mentioned, has done tiers for us for each of those sites as well. So the major sites, he's got tiers, which can kind of help interpret the rankings a little bit more instead of just drafting purely off the rankings. I've been doing a Q&A each week in our Discord as part of that package. So 1 hour each week, I'll answer any questions anyone has on our rankings, strategy, whatever it is. So we had that and just some additional content. Jack Miller, Justin Herzig, one of the better best ball players in the industry, is part of our team. So yeah, really excited for that this year.
Yeah, it's definitely very cool. And wanted to kind of so a lot of people know you for your content, Mike, where, whether it's best ball, whether it's DFS, whether it's redraft, like you're looked at as a very sharp voice in the industry. But one thing I don't think people necessarily know about you is you've got a history in high stakes competitions. If you play FFPC main events and FFC prime times, you're going to bump heads with Mike at some point, and you've done well over the years. And I know you've jumped into a few of these early FFPC drafts, and I'm sure you've got some drafts sort of planned for the rest of the summer. But just from a macro perspective, is there anything that really kind of stands out to you from early drafts this year? I know that we've seen like sort of the landscape change where the wide receivers get steamed up, the dead zones going a little later. This year we have tight end 1 going a little later. Quarterbacks have gotten pushed down. Just sort of anything that kind of jumps off your head that really you're kind of noticing in the early draft streets.
Yeah, first off, in terms of the FFPC higher stakes ones, I've learned that I should stick to 6-hour slow drafts, not 2-hour slow drafts, because I got burned a couple of times with auto drafting the 2-hour slows. But jokes aside, I think one thing I've noticed each of the past 2 years is those 350s for like season-long redraft managed league, as opposed to the best ball drafts on FFPC. To me, they just seem like a lot softer early in the offseason, relatively speaking. The ADP isn't as wide receiver heavy. It's not as rookie heavy. You can draft some really strong teams, maybe some even safer teams with taking like an anchor RB or 2 early in the first several rounds and still kind of hit on a lot of the rookie wide receivers that you want to get exposure to because they're cheaper. So you can afford to kind of detour from wide receiver early. So I do like to try and get in a handful of those drafts early each offseason. I think that's like a really good spot for people to play. Obviously, you have to manage those teams once the season rolls around, but I think those are pretty plus EV.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that there's specific pockets that are very strong. I think the 1-2 turn is really, really strong right now. It usually is this time of year. A couple guys always steam up when we get to the end of the summer. But I think the 1-2 turn is very strong. I like drafting in the middle because I think right now the middle of the third is very strong. It's interesting how it's going to correct itself as we move into like August and early September drafts. But one question that I know I asked John Daigle when he was here, and I asked pretty much every single one of my guests, and we've got some very cool answers on this, is you're continually updating your best ball rankings. I know you have a big part of all of your rankings process over at ETR. If you could know the final stats of any single veteran player this season, who would it be, Mike?
Yeah, I was thinking about this one, and I'm going to go with Kyren Williams because that workload for the Rams is so valuable when you got it down the stretch. I mean, you're talking a player that was worthy of a first-round pick in terms of that type of production that we had for him. It's just we don't know, is he going to repeat that workload, the injury concerns at the running back position in general. And if you knew his stats, it would also give you some insight as to what to do with Blake Corum, because we know somebody here is going to be really valuable from a fantasy perspective. So I think too, FFPC, he's still going pretty early, but even there, he's dropped into, I'm trying to see here, at times he'll get into the third round. He's still mostly second round, but he'll fall the third round at times. Underdog, he falls to the late third a lot. And that's in a half PPR format. If you knew the Kyren Williams you were getting, that could be an absolute smash to kind of do a wide receiver start from the back end of the first round and to get Kyren Williams in the third.
That's a very interesting point about structure with these running backs. And two-part question, just sort of what sort of exposure level, without pulling out your exact numbers, have you been clicking the button on Kyren with? Because I know he's sort of a hot button player. I've had some very smart people in your seat, like Nelson Sousa, who are just fading him. Other people are bringing up I know John's sort of on your pathway where he's targeting him because of the ADP correction and the potential role. Where do you fall in line with that, Mike?
I did actually look it up. You told me off the top of my head, but I looked up the specific number. So underdogs, where I've done most of my drafts, there I have him at 11% so far, which is kind of boring, but it's above average. And I think there, like, the ceiling in a half PPR format is really high. I think people are maybe a little too bullish on Blake Corum right now as far as to how much he's going to cut in to Kyren's base workload. So I do like him there. But then when you start getting like the full PPR sites where the wide receivers are more valuable and you start shifting Kyren more to like the 2-3 turn as opposed to the 3-4 turn, I won't have very much of him there. So I hope that's not a cop-out answer. But yeah, I'm very happy to take him end of the round 3 in a half PPR format. Less excited to take him at the 2-3 turn in a full PPR format.
It would have been more impressive if you didn't have to look it up and you could just pull out your exposures out of your head. I'm at 17%. This guy, but it's an interesting one, and I know you're going to go pretty high level on certain contests, and I think that 11% shows that you're bullish enough, not a fade, but not a guy that you're just continually clicking the button without even kind of diving into percentages of exposure. Is there a number this type of year when we're in this portion of the season, like the late June, early July drafts, where you get scared if you're at a certain percent on a player, or are you a little bit more averse to roster percentages and exposure?
It varies a little bit by site. I generally diversify a lot, but some of that's natural. Like, I will take ADP values quite frequently if they fall, even if I don't necessarily love the player. So I'd say where I've done most of my drafts on underdog, I'm probably not higher than like 30% on a player, but I'll have a few guys in, the mid 20s, nearing 30% there. But I'm not purposely diversifying too much yet. I remember last year, for example, we were way ahead of market on Nico Collins, and I was like pulling back on Nico Collins, and then his ADP rose a lot over the offseason. So it's like I pulled back when we had him as a really good value. And then I couldn't, really end up drafting him a ton later in the offseason anyways, because his price just shot up. So I'd rather be aggressive now and then correct over the course of the summer than trying to like constantly battle like, oh, I'm at 30%, I got to be at 20%. I don't really think like that. I will say on some of the other sites where I think the underdog or the ADP might not be quite as sharp as underdog, I'm more willing to take bigger stands. I know some of the rookie wide receivers on FFPC DraftKings, which we'll talk about in the show today, but there's a pocket of them where you can get even like 8th, 9th rounds. And at those price tags, I think I'm okay right now being really heavily invested on those types of players and not worrying too much about where my exposure is, even if it gets up to like 35, 40% there.
Yeah, and I think you kind of nailed it. It's when you have sort of a sliding scale with percentages and exposure, where you don't necessarily want to have a guy in the first or second round where you're 30, 40%, even 28%. But when you get to those later rounds, like the hit rates of the guys going around to Nico Collins last year were not good. So it's sort of like your opportunity cost balanced with, being overexposed to a guy, but the potential other players around him have poor results. It makes your error like even more amplified. And that I think that's something where like I'll have a ton of exposure on a guy like Marshawn Lloyd, and he's going in a range where if I sort of miss on him, it's not necessarily going to kill my builds. But if he really hits, I'm going to kick myself for not, sticking to my conviction and sticking to my guns in that range of the draft. Definitely an interesting one. Pivoting back over to the structural element, you brought up, wide receiver, followed by a running back. Do you think this could be the edge we're looking at with sort of the movement of the dead zone where, right now you have running backs 9, 10, and 11 going in the third round on FFPC. If we were talking 5 years ago at this time, running backs 9, 10, and 11 would have been like your classic early second round guys and lock a top 18 picks. Do you think that this is the edge where it's sort of a modified hero RB strategy could be a way that we could kind of exploit this market, Mike?
Yeah. So the way I like to exploit the market right now is to not fall behind wide receiver early, but then be more willing to deviate in those ranges. And you mentioned them where the running backs are falling to like the 3-4 turn. I can get Josh Jacobs at like, in the 5th round right now, who's someone that might have been going at the 2-3 turn before. So I think for a while there, if you went really wide receiver heavy, full zero RB, it worked out well. With the price tags adjusting, I'm sort of mixing that where like maybe I'll take 3 wide receivers in a row to start the draft, but I'm okay, circling back to that position a handful of rounds later and getting maybe even an RB1 elite quarterback and elite tight end. Like you could still fit in by round 6 now with the way some of these prices are. So you can, and it works out, to be really the strategy is like a balanced lineup, which is boring, but like you can achieve a lineup where you potentially have, the highest scoring wide receiver for the year, highest scoring running back, and one of the highest scoring onesie positions. Like it's not that crazy to think like that could exist on one roster. And previously there were a little bit more sacrifices. Like you couldn't really do that, right? Like if you wanted to take potentially the highest scoring running back, you probably can take that potentially high scoring wide receiver. There was some mixing and matching. So that's the way I'm looking at it. I still definitely want to be cognizant of having enough wide receiver firepower early, and I will do some drafts where if the value falls, like I'll take wide receiver ×5 out of the gate. But most of my drafts are like 3 to 4 wide receivers in the first 6 rounds, but I've drafted 2 of them in the first 3. And then I've deviated to tight end, quarterback, running back throughout.
No one wants to hear the answer for your preferred draft strategy to be balance or value-based or anything. It's like keep it something exciting, Mike. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to find out which rookie Mike can't wait to find out the 2024 stats of.
This episode is made possible by Underdog Fantasy, and Underdog Fantasy is the leader in best ball. When you go to join an Underdog Fantasy best ball draft, it fills very quickly. Especially now, it's Best Ball Mania season, baby. Best Ball Mania 5. I can't believe they're at Best Ball Mania 5 already. $15 million in prizes. They're giving out $15 million with $1.5 million to first. Playing in best ball leagues makes you better. It helps train you on player value and strategy. And Underdog offers a lot more than just best ball contests. They offer pick'ems. My new favorite, the golf pick'ems. But they have the NBA pick'ems, baseball pick'ems going on throughout the offseason. Hit the pick'ems, back to best ball, hit the pick'ems. So use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. So they've increased the maximum deposit bonus. It was $100. Now it's up to $125. When you get the Underdog app, use promo code Underworld and go draft your ass off.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with Mike Leone of Establish the Run. This year, we're not getting any discounts on rookies. You have 2 quarterbacks being drafted as QB1s. You have 2 of the highest drafted, if not the highest drafted, rookie wide receivers ever in Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors. Brock Bowers living in top 10 tight end land in every single format. If you could know the final stats of any single rookie this year, who would it be, Mike?
Yeah, I'll go with the rookie wide receiver position because that's where you see guys that really win leagues quite often is the rookie wide receiver. And it's such a difficult position to parse through where you get a lot of failures. Like we had Jackson Smith and Jigba and Quentin Johnston really failed their ADPs last year, but the guys that do hit, like a Tank Dell or a Puka Nakua, are so impactful. So for me, I pick a little bit out of fear. I did a Aren't You Worried podcast with Eric Beimfor and Pat Kyren, and the guy that epitomizes that for me is Xavier Worthy, where right now, at least on Underdog, a little bit behind the market on where Xavier Worthy is. The bull case for him is so like simple and easy, where it's like round one wide receiver who is the fastest combine time ever goes to play with Patrick Mahomes, and you're going to feel really silly if you weren't in on that and it hits. But I am a little worried that we're getting overly optimistic with him. So I'd love to know Xavier Worthy. And of course, kind of like the Kyren Williams one too, that'll have a funnel down effect where if you know Worthy's stats, you kind of start to piece together, who the other values for KC are in terms of Hollywood Brown and whatnot, where else you could probably go.
I love the Xavier Worthy answer. I don't hear that too often. And I think what's interesting is I've been like a big advocate for drafting rookie wide receivers for years. It has sort of been a cheat code. Even last year, you referenced like the Puka Nakua, Tank Dell, and certainly I wasn't, sitting here in July saying draft Puka Nakua and Tank Dell in your drafts. I wish I was, but I've always viewed the wide receiver spot as a place we can find ADP wins. But now it sort of feels like rookie wide receivers are the new second-year wide receivers, where it used to be like drafters betting on the unknown upside of second-year wide receivers having big breakouts. Now this whole rookie kind of wide receiver market is being pushed up. What are your thoughts on the Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas, Keon Coleman tier going ahead of a guy like Jackson Smith and Jigba, where we have a little more example of him on an NFL field? You brought up him being a bust last year, but it's sort of like chasing the upside versus chasing a guy progressing in year two. It's just an interesting kind of phenomenon for me to see with drafters this year.
Yeah, it is. And JSN's a really interesting juxtaposition where he was a prospect we really liked. He had a disappointing, but not like egregiously bad rookie season. So he is the type of year two bet that is quite often undervalued. I know for us with our ETR ranks, we're like a little bit ahead of ADP on JSN and a little bit behind on all those rookies right now. But comparatively, we still have them ranked within like 10 spots of one another. So I want exposure to some of those rookie wide receivers, Ladd, Xavier Worthy, Keon, and some to JSN, which I know is another kind of boring answer to my balanced lineup one early, but I'll probably, right now have a little bit more JSN than McConkey and Worthy if JSN is going to go a full round cheaper than those guys.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I'm sort of team JSN at Player Profiler. Billy Muzio and I had a bet last year that I lost on JSN's production. We're back at it this year. I have another bet. This year I'm going to take Billy's money on that one. But he's sort of like, I think you nailed it, where we were sort of spoiled by the success of other rookies, and JSN gets punished because we kind of overinflated his ADP as a market. But again, it's like guys who put up those stats can get better. You can go back historically in the league. There's plenty of guys who did pretty much nothing or just flashed as rookies, took big steps forward in year two. So I'm betting on JSN sort of returning wide receiver 2 production this year at a much cheaper cost. So definitely an interesting one. Want to backtrack over to a little bit of draft strategy. Actually, you know what? Let's go draft strategy here, because we talked a little bit in the pre-show about bully tight end. And this is one where this is sort of like July is the month where everybody's going to get on and say, this is the strategy you need to win in fantasy this year. There's different sites that are going to take different takes. Certainly I'll have my preferred strategies, but at the end of the day, it's pick the right players and any strategy can get executed. But when it comes to bully tight ends, this is one where the market is pretty much anti this strategy. And we can specifically focus on FFPC for this one. So let's even take it to a tight end premium format. For years, we saw Travis Kelce getting steamed up into the top 5 overall in like an FFPC. So tight end 1 was a huge value. You'd have to use the top 5 pick to get him. Oftentimes he returned value. And then in a lot of years, we'd see tight end 2 settle into the first round. You think about the year with Darren Waller, years with Mark Andrews. This year is different. You see entire FFPC drafts where no tight end goes in the first round. Is there an argument for double tapping the position if you're holding like the 10, 11, 12 spot, where you can get an opportunity to have two of the top 5 scorers and at the tight end position? Or do you think that this is a strategy that even in tight end premium is one that you would kind of stay away from? And let's specifically look at a managed format. So like a 350 or a main event. This would be like your redraft, not your best ball.
So I think there's a reason why I'm pro bully tight end on FFPC, to just be straight with that. And there's a couple reasons why I think it works on FFPC compared to other sites. Obviously, the tight end premium scoring, but if you look at that, like not only is that boosting the top guys, I think sometimes the ADP on those guys adjusts maybe like fairly or like under adjusts even in a year like this year. But then the ADP on the guys that like are third tier get pushed up like way too much. So one, I don't want to like get caught like overpaying for, I'm looking at a draft that I did and it's like round 10 Tyler Conklin or something, when I could be taking, a high upside, Blake Corum or Trey Benson, like some of these high upside rookie running backs at that point. If I've gotten behind at tight end, I might have to do something like that. So understanding the draft dynamics is part of why I like it. I think just relative to where they should be priced, I think the early tight ends are straight up better bargains than the mid round or late tight ends. The other reason is with the 2 flex spots on FFPC, you can start up to 3 tight ends, so I'm just looking, I'm drafting this, like I'm drafting extra pass catchers to win the flex. We always talk about winning the flex, and you can, pass catchers having upside is the way we want to win the flex. That extends to tight end. So I'm very pro doing it. I think right now, you mentioned the 1-2 turn. I'm looking at a draft that I did. This is actually a best ball one as opposed to the 350, but I have a 351 where I did something similar. But the person on the turn went Laporte to Kelsey at the 1-2 turn. That wasn't my team. That was a different, but I think that's viable.
Yeah.
I went McBride in the middle of the second, Andrews middle of the third, and then even Evan Ingram again middle of the fourth, where I'm just thinking like Evan Ingram with his catch volumes, like outscoring a lot of these players, like even a DK Metcalf when you do the 1.5 per reception. So I'm very pro bully tight end there. And it's completely different from like a best ball underdog league where you've only got one flex and the gap between the elite tight ends and the bottom tier tight ends isn't as much, where if those guys just catch a touchdown on a given week, like that's fine with the half PPR scoring. But you look at, Trey McBride going 8 for 70 at 1.5, you're at a 20-point game without a touchdown with that. So I think the discrepancy between the elite tight ends and the bottom tier is just so big on FFPC.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that, and I like how you put Evan Ingram in that tier, and I think the market's sort of coming around on that. You're seeing more and more Evan Ingram sneaking into like the 3rd and 4th round in FFPC. I think that's correct. I wonder if the tight end position last year, we saw a number of players go over 200 PPR points in like a standard format. I think that there's also a little bit of viability where you talk about tight end versus wide receiver in a format like an NFFC, not being afraid to use one of these potentially elite tight ends in your flex and double tapping in that sense. Again, you wouldn't have to use the top 3 draft pick, but a guy like a Dalton Kincaid becomes an affordable player. Just an interesting one to look at, and a strategy that, you're not going to be competing with too many people when you go bully tight end. Let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned Dalton Kincaid. I want to specifically talk about your Buffalo Bills, because I think this is a team that's giving people a lot of pause right now. What is your preferred way of drafting Bills? How do you think that this is going to play out for the Bills, specifically looking at Dalton Kincaid, James Cook, and sort of your preferred way to attack Buffalo wide receivers? And in case anybody doesn't know this, Mike is a diehard Bills fan, so I really like getting your opinion on the Buffalo Bills. I think even though you're a diehard, you're still pretty realistic with your fantasy expectations for these guys. So let's start with Kincaid. Kincaid's going to cost you a premium pick, whether it's underdog, whether it's FFPC, whether it's NFFC. Last year, he set the Bills record for rookie receptions. This was historically in the NFL, he was right up there in terms of historical numbers. He happened to play the same year with Sam Laporta, but I would say last year was still a big win for what Buffalo wanted out of that position. Now you're having to pay premium tight end prices for Kincaid, but he's got a pathway to being the number one target in a Josh Allen-led offense. In or out on Dalton Kincaid where he's going, your expectations for him in year 2?
Yeah, I'd say I'm mostly in, particularly on FFPC. Again, I think he has like a pretty big scoring discrepancy between the two sites because I think the catch volume is really, really safe no matter what happens with him. The efficiencies where he was like kind of middling last year, and that's if you're really in on Kincaid, you're hoping he takes that step forward where he had the volume last year. Now he gets that volume plus the absence of Diggs, and maybe the efficiency takes another step. But the Bills are difficult to figure out because you've got so many rushing touchdowns coming from Josh Allen. They went run heavy down the stretch last year. They're a team where I really don't know where their pass rate's going to be. Like they could be above league average by a couple points. I wouldn't be surprised. They could have a 59% pass rate. I wouldn't be totally surprised. So there's a lot of volatility in terms of like just starting with the play calling for the team, where you go from there. So I'd say mostly in on Kincaid. I think his price on underdog starting to slip more into the 5th round, and that's where I'm more comfortable taking him there. I was a little bit worried when he was 4th round there, just with some reliance on catch volume and that not adding up quite as much on a half PPR site. But he's now in the 50s. We have him ranked 54 overall, so we're pretty in line. And I like in general being, almost any format, getting like one of these top 7 to 8 tight ends.
With you on Kincaid, I love Kincaid. It's one of my guys at Player Profiler, and I think he's gonna crush this year. I think there's an outside chance that he could be tight end 1 overall. Let's talk about James Cook, though. This is one where last year he was a big ADP hit. People were drafting him as a low-end RB2, ends up finishing as an RB1, and also he gave you impactful games in the second half of the season when it really mattered. He was one that definitely benefited from the offensive coordinator change to Joe Brady. Now, if I want to draft James Cook, I've got to use a 4th-round pick on him. He is a high-end RB2, brushing up on RB1 land. Do you have a comfort level on drafting James Cook in this range? Do you have any trepidation? And are you interested in guys like Ray Davis, potentially his backups?
Yeah, so we're pretty in line with the market on Cook positionally, but the sites treat the positions very, very different. If you look at Cook on underdog, his ADP is 58. If you look at him, the FFPC, like Fantasy Pros Championship, he's going like 44 overall. That's that 4th-round price tag you mentioned. I think that's way too rich of a price tag on a full PPR site where you've got so many pass catchers with huge ceilings to take. Now, you start talking an underdog team and he's there at the 5-6 turn and you've already hit a few wide receivers. That's where I'm okay leaning in on Cook. And again, positionally, we have him ranked right with ADP. It's just how the sites are treating the positions is very different. I think just zooming out, he does have a lot of explosiveness. He's utilized in the passing game a good bit. There's always going to be concerns about Cook by the goal line, but I think overall his usage should be pretty similar to last year when he was a decent sized hit with just some chance that he breaks a few more big plays. He dropped like 4 wide open touchdowns last year. So I'm still fairly optimistic on Cook.
Yeah, I think the like you referenced the dropping the touchdowns. We've also seen some untimely fumbles here and there. I just worry a little bit about those sort of mistakes with a guy with a little bit more juice behind him, like Ray Davis, that can be a little bit more like for like. But this is you're in on Kincaid, you're sort of in on Cook. This is the tough one though. Who's your preferred wide receiver in Buffalo? And are we going to see a wide receiver establish himself where we're like, this was an ADP steal? This is a guy who ends up becoming a weekly starter. The sort of the way the cycle of life for Bills fantasy wide receivers with Josh Allen, we had Cole Beasley and John Brown hitting sort of career highs with Allen. Then we moved on to them getting a real alpha wide receiver 1 like Stephon Diggs and him crushing, being a wide receiver 1 every single year. Gabe Davis was up and down as a fantasy asset and sort of the way we treat him in the market, but the guy had nearly 30 touchdown catches for Allen. So is there a guy with Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, where you're like, this guy is the one or is it going to be like a balanced, kind of annoying wide receiver room for us as drafters?
I think it could be balanced and annoying as a room. And like I said at the top, talking about the Bills, how the team just approaches play calling in general, it's going to have a big impact on this. If they're passing 62, 63% of the time, it's going to be hard for one of these guys not to beat the ADP where they're going right now. If they're passing like 58% of the time, it could be disappointing if it's spread out. I do prefer Coleman. The market's got him first, but I do think just taking that rookie uncertainty and upside is worth it. I know there's been some not too glowing comments by the GM about Keon Coleman recently, but that seems to be really factored into the market, whereas ADP's fallen off basically across the entire industry, making him a pretty affordable rookie wide receiver given his draft capital and the potential for targets and just the offensive support around him. Like you compare him to, someone like Ladd McConkey, who's in a good spot, clearly in terms of target competition, but so is Keon Coleman. But Ladd, he got drafted after Keon, and he's playing with a quarterback that's probably not as good as Josh Allen. He's playing on a team that probably runs more than Buffalo. And I think there might just be some overconfidence with the rookie wide receivers in general over like which ones are going to be good and which ones aren't. So to me, that leaves Keon as a pretty good value of the three Bills wide receivers right now between him, Samuel, and Shakir.
Is there a argument for double tapping the position because of the affordability of these guys at ADP? And let's ignore best ball. Let's go to redraft. If it's a 20 round, and I believe this was a Sean Siegel argument that I heard on a RotoViz pod about potentially double tapping. And if I'm wrong on this one, Sean's stuff is still really good to listen at. But if it was another person, I listen to a lot of people. So Sean's argument, I believe, was that you could take Samuel and Coleman at cost and sort of get something out of it. I don't know if this was a best ball or redraft, but that sort of stuck with me because maybe there's potential where this is a two wide receivers settle in as like high-end wide receiver threes, low-end wide receiver twos. And if the offense is strong enough, that could be something where they could be guys where we're very happy to have them on our roster. And again, the cost is there where it's not killing me to double tap it. Do you think in like a 20 round FFPC or NFFC format, double tapping the sort of ambiguity at the wide receiver spot is something that could pay off? Or are you setting yourself up potentially for a double loss?
No, I think it could potentially pay off. You look at the cost on Keon Coleman in like the FFPC redraft leagues right now, it's like around pick 100. So you're talking like a ninth round pick. That's pretty good for upside rookie wide receiver. And in a managed league, I think people probably underestimate how frequently players are drops and not on your team by the end of the season that get drafted starting in like even round 7, but like especially like rounds 8, 9, 10. So to be able to go Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, even Khalil Shakir, who will throw in there, to use 2 or 3 picks from rounds 9 through 12, I think is completely viable to hope that one of them clearly emerges as a big winner. If it's spread out a lot, then one of them should at least still be pretty startable for you, and you can manage the wire and decide if you want to keep the other two. But it is tough to parse, though, just because, Coleman's the upside pick, but the least certain for day one volume. Samuel's the kind of, sexier pick between him and Shakir, where I know his reception perception from Matt Harmon's always been like really strong. He's always really liked him. He's now in a better spot than he's ever been in. But then Shakir like dominated on a per target basis last year. It's just like we're having some difficulty really seeing him expand his targets in a big way. So I'd like to say I have a great handle on this as a Bills fan, but I really don't. But yeah, Coleman's still my pick, and I do think there's validity in the strategy that you outlined with double tapping the Bills receivers at their cost. You're talking wide receiver 4 costs on all these guys right now, more or less.
Yeah, and I like how you bring up the fact that more of these guys in this range will end up being cuts for us than we want to realize at this point. Like there's a lot of busts when you start getting down to wide receiver 5 land, low end wide receiver 4 land historically. One guy who never busts, and it's sort of a quarterback strategy question for you, Josh Allen. We just talked all about the Buffalo Bills. Josh Allen is still QB1. Jalen Hurts is still QB2. A year ago at this time, we saw the quarterback position getting steamed up like we haven't seen in years. It was a return to early quarterback. It wasn't like the old days with like a round one single QB quarterbacks, but Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts were routinely selected in round two. A lot of times those guys were going at the 2-3 turn in FFPC drafts, even higher in NFFC drafts with the 6-point passing touchdowns. And in home leagues, those guys were in fuego. Now the market has adjusted the quarterback spot dramatically. These guys are going, all of them are like 4th round picks when it comes to the truly elite guys, like the Josh Allen, and then Hurts, sometimes you get him in round 5. And then when it comes to Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, those guys usually join him in round 5, early round 6. So it's been sort of a dramatic shift, not only in the tight end market, but the quarterback market. Is the edge now going early quarterback, which is sort of like, we usually kind of go away from that strategy.
Yeah.
But it seems like it could be an overcorrection type year. Are you on that, or are you still looking to find your QB values below the elite level guys?
Yeah, I think in best ball, it's an edge if you can get those guys in round 4 in particular. And Hurts is the guy that we're particularly above market on, where I just think there's a really big overreaction, not just to like how the position fared last year in general, but on Hurts specifically, just with them kind of floundering down the stretch, where I expect this offense to get injected with a little bit of life with Kellen Moore to be a bit more dynamic. And Hurts still, like, with his rushing touchdown upside and the elite pass catching talent alongside him, I just think the ceiling for him still really enormous, that he can pay off a cost like that. So it's hard in terms of stacking sometimes with these guys. Like that's the wrinkle where, if you take Allen and you don't get Kincaid, and then it's like, how early do you pull the trigger on the receivers? That can be difficult, but I'm going to try to be like a little bit above market on these guys. I don't think they're absolute smashes. Like this is like the new skeleton key for this year, but I do think they're undervalued.
I think one thing that's interesting about those guys at that range is they certainly have the ceilings. We've seen these guys finish as QB1s, but like their floor is really, really high. And again, it's a level where that range of the draft, sort of the hit rates for guys, it seems like it's a safer way of playing, but it's also has a little bit of edge because of the ADP adjustment. So I think early QB is an interesting one this year, and that's one I'm definitely going to look into a little bit more in some of my drafts this month in case the sort of the market adjusts. But let's pivot over from quarterback. Let's talk a little bit about some teams. I know that we're going to talk. I have 2 teams circled that we're going to talk about, but just as a general question to you, every year we see these mispriced offenses where multiple ADP winners can emerge. We see it on the high end. We see it on the low end. Like recently you've had these teams that drafters had no interest in like having exposure to, like last year with Tampa Bay, where Mike Evans, Rashad White, Baker Mayfield, all huge ADP hits. The year before that, Seattle was the one where Tyler Lockett got pushed down to like wide receiver 5 land. DK Metcalf was like a wide receiver 3. Ken Walker was affordable, and Geno Smith was left for dead. All 4 of those guys beat ADP. And then on the high end, last year, Detroit, great example. Everybody hits at ADP. The year before that, we saw Miami, Philadelphia. Everybody hits at ADP. What is an offense that you see that could provide multiple ADP winners and really sort of punch up above its current value?
Yeah, there's a couple. One, we just talked about Jalen Hurts, but an elite offense that could, I think, in terms of the pass catchers, could be Philly. You're talking pretty expensive price tags on those guys. So, but I still think that they could. The one that I've been drafting the most that's a bit more of a value approach is Jacksonville. I think the Jaguars provide a ton of potential here. I think, Lawrence ran pretty bad in terms of his final year passing statistics, in terms of just some bad luck on drop touchdowns and different things of that nature. I still think he's one of the better quarterbacks in the league. He was getting drafted in like the 60s last year. I don't think a ton has changed, and now he's getting drafted in like the 110s, 120s. This year he's dropped like 60 spots. So I think starting with him, he's a huge value. But then you look at this team, they got, they're arguably better positioned at wide receiver than they were last year in terms of fit with Trevor Lawrence, bringing in Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis as these boundary field stretcher wide receivers, getting rid of Calvin Ridley, who kind of had to play that role last year, and Zay Jones, who I just don't think is like really that talented overall. So they might be better positioned. And if you look at the way they spread out targets, even if you look at the games where everyone was healthy, Zay Jones as the wide receiver 3 there, 4 if you count, Evan Ingram, still had a 15-16% target share. So I still think like Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas, people look at this and they think, oh, well, Evan Ingram catches a bunch of balls, Christian Kirk catches a bunch of balls, is not good for competition. This is a team that throws to like 4 guys. Like these are going to be the 4 guys. They're going to play the majority of the snaps. And I think there's enough targets to go around. Brian Thomas is one of my favorite rookie wide receiver values, where I think I just look at there's a couple guys where I just look at the draft capital and I think and the prospect evaluations going into the draft. And I feel like people are overthinking post-draft where these guys should go. And that leaves Brian Thomas to me as like really undervalued when you start talking about taking him behind guys like Keon Coleman, Ladd McConkey, who I don't like necessarily dislike, but like those guys had much worse draft capital and were worse prospects than Brian Thomas. So I'm going to go with Jacksonville as the team that can really beat ADP across the board.
I really like that one. And I think it's an interesting that you bring up Brian Thomas. I've talked about Brian Thomas sort of like a rookie year DK Metcalf, where people are kind of pointing out the flaws, but if he simply just inherits the Calvin Ridley end zone targets and 80% of the targets overall, then he's an absolute smash this year. Athletically gifted, he has the size, and he has the role. So definitely an interesting one. I also think it's sort of a Christian Kirk. We know what he is. Even in the year where he was a wide receiver 1, there was a guy that really is not more than 130 target type. So there's opportunities there for Brian Thomas. Definitely an interesting one. Let's talk about another team that's sort of giving people a lot of pause, and that's the LA Chargers. I know you have a specific player in mind that you want to talk about as an ADP target on this team. But before we talk about the pass catchers, let's talk a little bit about the running backs. This is a team that we know is going to run the ball a lot. Is there a preferred target you have when it comes to Gus Edwards and then down to the Kamani Vidals and J.K. Dobbins? Do you think we're going to see one player establish themselves as a huge ADP winner here? Or is this a situation where it's going to be a running back by committee and we're going to struggle trusting these guys in our weekly lineups?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult spot for sure. I think the guy I'm most out on right now is J.K. Dobbins, just kind of like betting against, back-to-back, like really kind of severe injuries that are going to make it difficult for him to be the explosive back that he was and to stay on the field. So concerned about Dobbins. So I've been drafting a bit more of Edwards and Vidal right now. And, Kamani Vidal's, with Edwards even banged up a little bit, has a chance to really, he could potentially take this job. I'm always wary about taking too many of the rookie running backs that are backups at this point in the draft season, where, a month or two from now, we find out, they're not even the RB2. And we've been drafting these guys as like, oh, they're RB2 with contingent upside. And it's like, no, they're not even the RB2. So
they're not even active.
Yeah. So like, that happens way more than you think. So I could be falling into that trap with Vidal, but my eyes kind of flash with the upside too, where like he does have one of the cleaner paths to a really strong season. I know people like JJ Zachariason viewed him as sort of like an underrated prospect to begin with. And then you just layer in the fact that he's got kind of like some banged up backs in front of him aren't that great. He's on an offense that like projects to score decently, but projects to be run heavy. So I've been breaking my rookie running back rule with Vidal a little bit. He's the guy that I had the most exposure to out of this trio.
It's definitely an interesting one, the Greg Roman effect. And will Greg Roman sort of impose his will on this offense like we saw in Baltimore? It certainly seems like Justin Herbert is a guy that you need to treat differently. And I think Roman's alluded to this, saying that he, can be a little bit more diversified in his approach. And obviously he's not going to use Herbert in the Lamar Jackson type role. it's just hard to get away from your priors when we've seen a guy his first year in Baltimore, like set an NFL record in terms of rushing yardage. You think he's going to try to do that, especially with a guy like Harbaugh. So a weird team. That being said, the receiver spot is really odd because they lose Keenan Allen, they lose Mike Williams. Tight end wise, we've had success in like the Harbaugh Roman tree historically, where we thought maybe they would attack like a Brock Bowers in the draft. That certainly didn't happen. They've got no one really of note at the tight end spot that we think could be a big target earner. So specifically looking at the wide receivers, the market is very high on Ladd McConkey right now, but you have another wide receiver that you've been drafting a lot of. Why don't you talk about him, Mike?
Yeah, I've been drafting a lot of Josh Palmer, which is, the boring selection here, but I do think that he's been just good enough, right? That he's not going to break out in this huge way, all of a sudden have this massive efficiency standpoint, but he's the incumbent wide receiver one there. Quentin Johnson was a disaster his rookie season. Ladd McConkey, as much as we want to be excited about him, is a rookie that we don't know a lot about. And even if he's good, like Josh Palmer seems really insulated in terms of the amount of targets that he's going to get. And I know we want to be careful not taking too many guys on the basis of projectable volume. Like you can get in trouble then where you get kind of like, Ben Gretsch talks about you want like guys that are small misses but could be big hits. And Josh Palmer is maybe more like a small hit, potentially big miss guy when you look at his talent. But I think he's maybe more like a small hit, but like also like not a huge probability of taking a loss where he's going. These are the players that I typically like more in best ball, where I think the fact that they're going to be out there each week compiling statistics matters a little bit more in best ball versus redraft, where when you're working the wire and stuff, like you can find a replaceable guy here and there, and you kind of want to just shoot for upside and try and draft as many potential league winners as you can, knowing you can replace them. So I like him a bit more for best ball, but I just think overall the market's really undervaluing him. And even with the Roman stuff that you mentioned, it seems really baked in by the market. I do want to give Roman like some credit that he might be a little bit different than he was. Like when he was in Buffalo with Tyrod Taylor, you're obviously going to run a certain offense, and it was a very successful offense. And he's been successful kind of wherever he's went from an efficiency standpoint. He's probably going to do things a little bit differently with Justin Herbert as opposed to the quarterbacks that he's coached so far.
Yeah, definitely an interesting one to see the Greg Roman effect. And Justin Herbert is an interesting one, especially for best ball, because it's a guy who we've had to draft as a mid-level QB1, if not a high-level QB1 for multiple seasons. And now he's just sitting there every single draft as a mid-level QB2. It could be a talent overcomes potential situation and playmakers situation. Herbert could end up being a big ADP winner. But let's talk a little bit about another offense where people are banking on a big breakout in Chicago. And there's one player in particular that you've enjoyed drafting a lot on these Chicago Bears.
Yeah, that's Rome Odunze. And it's somewhat similar to the Brian Thomas take, but like even more so, where I think people are overthinking the landing spot and underthinking the talent. This was a receiver that was clearly a tier 2 wide receiver in terms of prospects. You had Marvin Harrison tier 1. Some people had neighbors also in tier 1. Some people had neighbors in tier 2 with Odunze, but like those were the top 3 receivers, and Odunze was up there. He gets the draft capital that's associated with that. The Bears sounded like they had him actually as their wide receiver 1. They get him at 9th overall in the draft. And I did a show with Pat Frey, and it's like Ladd McConkey's going before Rome Odunze in a lot of places, and he was the wide receiver 9 drafted. He was 9th at his position. Odunze was 9th overall. And I just think this could be a situation where people are overthinking the target competition, especially with the way some of these offenses can run, where yes, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are there, but a lot of offenses nowadays, like they can be still condensed among 3 or 4 guys. Like we talked about it with Jacksonville, they're only going to throw to 4 guys. So I still think there's room for Odunze to get targets even with those 2 guys. And that also, dismisses the possibility that Odunze just a superstar right away, in which case, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that he does lead the team in targets just because he's that good. So I feel pretty good about Odunze, and this offense in general, just a huge talent upgrade from last year, quarterback position, wide receiver depth, just across the board. I think that they're a fun offense to bet on a little bit, but Odunze is the best way to make that bet.
I love the Odunze enthusiasm. He's another one where I'm sort of butting heads with some people that do projections, where I think we're also getting a market-wise, you bring up the Lad McConkey versus Odunze. Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you put it in that sort of context, but I think that we're getting the benefit that people were burned on JSN with Odunze's valuation. It's sort of a cautionary tale where we're not going to let you guys do that to us again. This guy has target competition, but target competition doesn't matter if you're an alpha. At the end of the day, the alpha always wins out. And I think what's interesting is Chicago drafts Caleb Williams, their savior, their franchise quarterback, and in a loaded offensive line draft, they pass up on offensive linemen to take Odunze and get him a target instead. So I think they've got a plan for him, and he could be a guy who smashes in the second half of the season. And contingent value-wise, if anything happens to Keenan Allen, you've already won if Keenan Allen misses time, and you're talking about a 32-year-old. Keenan Allen obviously has had better injury luck in several of the last seasons, but last year he missed some time, and he's on a brand new team. So love that one. We're back on Kyle Pitts as well this year, Mike. Talk about your Kyle Pitts enthusiasm. And this is the year. This is the year for Kyle Pitts. He's going to crush it. Tell everybody why.
I think that the Atlanta offense, obviously people have adjusted for the quarterback change, the coaching change. I just don't think they've adjusted enough. Like Arthur Smith did really weird things with personnel. I think now you're going to see Kyle Pitts just running a ton of routes. Like it's not going to be Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith like running kind of like even like it was at times last year. And then in terms of pass rate, like what a huge difference in terms of like how the team calls plays, but also the quarterback. When you've got guys like Heineke, Ritter, Mariota the past couple of seasons, these are guys that will take sacks, they will scramble. So not only do you not get a lot of called pass plays, but a lot of those called pass plays don't even turn into a pass attempt. With Kirk Cousins, a called pass play turns into a pass attempt at an extremely high rate. So there's going to be a ton of volume available for these guys. And Kyle Pitts is still really young. I'm still banking on like that rookie season he had, what type of prospect he was. I just think it's going to be a rare opportunity where I don't think, and people will call me crazy and like blue pilled on Pitts, but like I don't think it's that much different of a bet like Kyle Pitts versus, Trey McBride in terms of the potential where these players could be in terms of where they're drafted next year.
Kyle Pitts is younger than Trey McBride, younger than Dalton Kincaid. Can Kyle Pitts lead the NFL in targets at the tight end position?
I don't know if he can quite get there on a volume basis with some of these guys, but I think he could lead them in yards. I think he could be the leader in yards at the tight end position.
Well, there you go with Kyle Pitts. We're going to do 2 quick ADP rapid fires, and I'm going to try to mix these in on all my shows. I gave Mike these before the show. Let me know in the comments. Should I blindly ask guests this, or should we give them in the pre-show? But you bring up Kyle Pitts and your enthusiasm for him. The market is high on Pitts, but the market is even higher on Drake London. Drake London is sitting there in the second round. On Underdog, he's practically a 1-2 turn pick, but in FFPC, NFFC, sitting there in the second round. He's neck and neck with Marvin Harrison Jr. So you have a potential third-year massive breakout with London, and then you have the highest drafted rookie wide receiver of all time, ADP-wise in redraft, with Marvin Harrison Jr. Which one of these two would you rather draft, Mike?
This is a tough one that you're hitting me with. I'm going to go with Drake London, but I will say, I really like both of these players. I think they're fine at their ADP, even with Harrison's being really aggressive for a rookie. But I'll go with London. Obviously, a lot of the same things I said about Pitts in terms of the team pass volume apply to Drake London. But it's a pretty condensed, there's not a lot of competition for targets here for Atlanta. We've seen the targets per route run be really strong for Drake London. I know after his rookie season, JJ Zacharyson of LateRound.com, he does a prospect guide, but he does like a year 2 prospect model. And he had London right up there with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, these players that we think super highly of, but maybe the market didn't, just because they weren't adjusting for the team pass volume. Like, that's how strong of a prospect and Drake London was. So I feel pretty good about him. There's some stuff with like ESPN Open Score and stuff where London didn't rate really well. It gives me a tiny bit of pause, but I think, that could also be attributed to the previous coaching staff and the scheme that they were running. So the potential for targets in an offense, I think, is going to be very good. Plays half their games indoors is huge. I'm going to go with London.
Yeah, and I'm fine with London in that range. I do slightly lean to Marvin Harrison Jr., but again, I don't want to be a guy who leans on tiers, but they'd both be in the same tier. But if I had one draft and it was head-to-head choice, I'm going Marvin Harrison Jr. So we're butting heads on that one. One more ADP, a difficult one. It might not be difficult for you, but a difficult one for drafters right now is George Pickens and Zay Flowers. These two guys are going in the late 4th, early 5th, right around the 4-5 turn. You've got two guys in the same division, AFC North guys. You've got year 3 George Pickens, and you've got year 2 Zay Flowers. So some unknown upside with both of them, and guys that drafters are betting on taking a step forward. Which one of these two would you be most interested in?
Yeah, so for me, I'm going to go with Zay Flowers here. I think there's just a bit more upside for him. Like, really phenomenal rookie season for Flowers, showed his explosiveness in a variety of ways. He's playing with the better quarterback. And previously we would said, like, well, the pass volume for Baltimore isn't that good, but they came up quite a bit last year, as we anticipated, with Monken as their OC. And Pittsburgh's probably going the opposite direction. They bring Arthur Smith over as their OC, who we just kind of dogged on with the Atlanta stuff. So I'm going to go with Flowers. I have more confidence in his talent. I have more confidence in the offense around him. So for me, that one's relatively easy. I see the allure of Pickens, who made a lot of big plays, and people like look at the small sample splits with Deontay Johnson out of there to potentially point towards a ton of targets. But I'm a little bit concerned that we're thrusting too many targets upon him just because we can, and there's not a lot of guys there. And he might not be the type of guy that really is going to be that type of target earner. Shaky quarterback play, not a lot of confidence in the OC. So Zay Flowers for me.
I'm Zay Flowers as well. I think I might be a little bit more bullish on Pickens than you are, but Zay Flowers is a guy that I think is very much mispriced. I think if he stays at this sort of range, I'm going to have a ton of Zay Flowers by the end of the summer. I think that the market is not giving Todd Monken enough credit that the offense could be even better in year 2. Year 1 in Baltimore, they scored very, very well. They go and get Derrick Henry. They're going to be healthier at tight end. But Zay Flowers is a guy who just kind of projects as a guy who could handle a very high target total. Pickens, even in a nice kind of like a bowl scenario, it's a guy that we'll put at 130. We've never seen a guy hit 130 with Arthur Smith, but 130 targets. Whereas Zay Flowers, I think if it's a great season for him, you're talking about him challenging like Derek Mason's catch total and being a big hit at ADP. Mike, let everybody know where they can find your podcast work. I know you talked a little bit about the best ball supplement guide that you work a lot of on the site, but I think people will want to hear you on your podcast as well.
Yeah, thanks, Theo. I've got a podcast, Establish the Edge. It's part of the Establish the Run network, but it's my own podcast. Episodes are a little bit sporadic, but they're topics that, I feel more passionately about. And right now doing the offseason projection special series with Ben Gretsch. And that's been really exciting. We're through the AFC South and NFC South are the first 2 divisions we did, but we'll be putting out 6 more episodes by the end of July to complete all the divisions. And that's been a big hit for listeners the past couple of seasons.
Yeah, Establish the Edge is really good. It's one that I download and listen to. Highly recommend all of Mike's work. Highly recommend that you stick with us at Press Coverage. We're going to be bringing on great guests all of July, and we're going to help you crush your drafts this season.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All In Package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you, especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.